They called me filthy. Imagine that, filthy. After all the years I spent bent over tubs of boiling water, wringing sheets stiff with the dirt of men and children, standing in laundromats when my arms already trembled from arthritis, washing until my fingers cracked open in winter, they dared to spit that word at me as though I had never known the feel of soap, as though I had been born of grime. It wasn't whispered either, not softened, not muttered under breath. It was barked, sharp as a slap, right in the kitchen where I had folded 100 shirts that were not mine, pressed them neat as if neatness could make me belong. "Don't touch my things, you're filthy." That's what she said, my daughter-in-law, her face pinched with disgust, her hand already reaching to snatch the blouse I was smoothing into a clean square. In that moment I dropped it, let the fabric fall to the tile like an accusation, and I said what I had not said in decades of swallowing hurt. "Filthy? Look in the mirror. Your greed left stains I can't wash." The silence after that was heavy, thicker than any detergent suds. She turned away, offended. But I stood straighter than I had in years, my chest aching with the shock of finally speaking truth. I am 78. I live in the house I paid for, though if you walked through its rooms, you would never know it, because my photographs are not on the walls, my dishes are not in the cupboards, my presence is tucked away into corners the way dust is brushed under rugs. The deed carries my name from when my husband and I signed it together decades ago, back when the siding was new and the yard was nothing but mud. My son insists it is his home now, insists he and his wife have made it theirs. But the mortgage payments I covered when he lost his job, the roof repairs I paid out of my savings, the years of scrimping on my part-time wages, those are buried under fresh coats of paint and the smell of expensive candles. Still, every floorboard remembers me. When I walk barefoot down the hall, I feel the echo of years when it was my footsteps, my voice, my children, running with damp hair after baths. Not this cold, curated silence where I am tolerated like an inconvenience. And yet, for all that history, for all that labor, for all that presence, I was branded filthy by the woman who married into the house as if she had scrubbed even one floorboard with her own knees. I live alone in this house even though bodies fill it. I say alone because there is no invitation in the way they speak to me, no real warmth in their words. They leave plates for me at the edge of the table but do not ask what I want to eat. They tell me to sit, to rest, to stay out of the way, as though my bones had turned to clutter. I used to be at the center of every gathering, the one who basted the roast, who ironed the tablecloth, who poured the coffee. Now I am a shadow that passes through the dining room with a tray, careful not to disturb the performance of a family that wants the appearance of generosity without the mess of gratitude. My son, my only child, walks a careful line between us, but his silence is not neutral, it is sharp, complicit. When she snapped that word at me, he did not defend me. He did not say, "Mother, you are not filthy. You are the cleanest hands I have ever known." No, he lowered his eyes, as if embarrassed to have me there, as if the shame belonged to me and not to the insult hurled at me, that cut deeper than the word itself. I will tell you something about being 78. It is not the creak in your knees or the pills lined up like soldiers on your nightstand that weigh on you most. It is the slow realization that the years of service, of sacrifice, of invisibility have added up to nothing in the eyes of those you gave them to. I worked, I saved, I cleaned, I cooked, I held the fevered heads of children through the night while their father snored, I stayed up to iron shirts so my husband could walk into the office pressed and respected, and when he died, I carried the weight of widowhood without once begging for pity. I did it all because I believed love and duty had value, that if I poured myself into them, something would be poured back into me. And yet here I am, called filthy by a woman who does not know what it is to scrub blood out of linens, who has never stood on her feet for 14 hours, who does not remember the smell of bleach burning your lungs while you work in silence because silence is the only way to avoid more demands. When I heard that word, when I saw her wrinkle her nose like I was an animal that had strayed inside, I felt a sharp split inside myself. One part of me wanted to weep, to crumple with the weight of decades, to ask how I had become so diminished that even my own child's wife saw me as dirt. But the other part, the part that remembered who I had been before marriage, before motherhood, before years of being useful, rose up, tall and fierce, and said no. I was not filthy. I was tired, yes. My hands were spotted with age, yes, but they were also the hands that bathed my son, the hands that folded his baby blankets, the hands that fed him when he could not feed himself. These were not dirty hands. These were sacred hands. And I could not, would not, allow them to be spoken of like refuse. That night, I lay in the narrow bed they call mine, tucked in the back corner of the house, and I thought about filth, about stains that never wash out, not because they are physical, but because they are moral. I thought about how greed leaves its mark on people, how selfishness spreads across a household like mildew, invisible at first, then blooming until it consumes everything. They think filth is dust on the furniture or smudges on glass, but the real filth is the kind that clings to souls when they treat others as disposable. My daughter-in-law polishes surfaces until they gleam, but underneath the shine lies rot. I know it because I feel it every time she smiles at neighbors, sweet and tight, while cutting me with her eyes the moment the door closes. She can scrub her counters all she likes, but the stain of cruelty, of arrogance, of treating an old woman as though she were less than human, that stain runs deeper than any detergent can reach. Do you know what it does to a woman to be told she is filthy when she has spent her whole life chasing cleanliness? It pulls at the seams of her memory. I remembered myself at 19, kneeling on the floor of a rented room with cracked plaster, washing my husband's work clothes in a basin because we could not afford machines. I remembered myself at 30, waking before dawn to wash diapers in boiling water, cloth heavy with waste, hands raw, no complaint. I remembered myself at 50, working in a care home, changing sheets stained with sickness, holding strangers with tenderness because their own children had forgotten them. I remembered myself at 65, still ironing my son's shirts before interviews because I wanted him to walk into the world without a wrinkle to give him away. Was that filthy? Or was that love in its most physical form? And if they cannot see it, then perhaps blindness is the dirtiest thing of all. So yes, she called me filthy. She spat the word like venom. But I am here to tell you, I am not the stain. They are. And the day will come, sooner than they think, when their gleaming counters and curated lives cannot cover it. I may be 78, I may live tucked into a back room like forgotten laundry, but I still know the difference between dirt and corruption. And when I dropped that blouse and spoke back, even if it was only one sentence, even if my son looked at me with quiet embarrassment, I felt something I had not felt in years. Clean. Clean of lies. Clean of silence. clean of the need to be their servant. For the first time in decades, the word filthy did not stick to me. It slid right off like water off cloth that has already been wrung too many times, and I knew I had reached the edge of something. The beginning of another story, one they will not control, one where I decide what stains to keep and what stains to finally wash away. It was not the word itself that split me open, not the sharp syllables of filthy that stung my ears, but what came after. The proof that her cruelty was not a passing flare of temper, but something rehearsed, something calculated, something sanctioned by the silence of my own son. Because betrayal, I learned, is not always a dramatic knife in the back, not always a grand act of disloyalty. Sometimes it is as simple and devastating as standing in the laundry room holding a crumpled blouse and realizing that the people you raised, the ones who carry your blood, are willing to let someone else reduce you to nothing, and worse, that they will let the insult stand because it is easier for them if you remain small, voiceless, compliant. That was the catalyst, the moment when I felt the world tilt, when I understood that I was no longer merely unwelcome, but being carefully pushed toward disappearance. She did not want me in her home, though it was also mine. She did not want me near her things, though my money had bought most of them. She did not want me in the photographs, though my blood runs through her children. And my son, the boy I had, rocked through fevers and heartbreak, allowed it because his life with her was simpler if I was silent. After that evening, small shifts began to reveal the truth in sharper relief, like stains blooming darker when the fabric dries. My cup was labeled with a sticker, guest, as if I were some stranger who had stumbled into their kitchen, as if I had not poured juice into plastic cups for him when he was little, watching him drink without even bothering to wipe his mouth. I found my clothes washed separately from the rest of the family's, sometimes not washed at all, set aside like they carried contagion, though I had never been careless with hygiene. Once I came upon her slipping my blouse into a separate bag, the kind used for rags or cloths, and when I asked, she smiled with that brittle edge and said it was for the best. The betrayal was not in the act itself, but in the casual way she performed it, confident that no one would challenge her, least of all her husband, my son. He walked in once as she scolded me for folding the children's socks. "She doesn't like anyone touching their things, Mom," he said, with that careful, measured tone, the one men use when they want to seem fair, but are really avoiding conflict. He might as well have said, "Don't upset her. It's easier if you just obey." That was when the ground truly gave way beneath me, because I could have forgiven her cruelty. She was never mine to raise, never mine to teach. But his acquiescence, his refusal to place my dignity above her convenience, that was betrayal in its purest form. Do you know what it feels like to stand in a house you helped build? To breathe the air of rooms you painted? To walk the floors you paid for? And still be treated as though you are trespassing. It is a strange kind of exile, a banishment that requires no distance. I was not locked out of the house, but I was exiled from its heart. Meals continued without me. Photographs were taken without me. Plans were made in whispers that stopped when I entered a room. And when I asked once if I might join them for an outing to the park, my daughter-in-law said, with a bright smile, that the children had a routine, and it was too hard to adjust. My son did not look at me when she said it, did not say, "Of course, Mom, come with us." He simply nodded along as though her word were final, and I felt the coldness of realization seep in. They were constructing a family that did not need me, And the easiest way to erase me was to brand me inconvenient, unsanitary, unfit. Filthy. The betrayal was not only in the insult, but in the strategy behind it. They wanted me small enough to disappear, so they made my presence feel contaminating, burdensome, shameful. In the weeks that followed, I noticed conversations that faltered when I stepped into the room. Glances exchanged across the dinner table, sudden shifts in tone. Once, I heard her whisper, "We have to think about the future, Adam. This isn't sustainable." She did not lower her voice enough, or perhaps she wanted me to hear. Sustainable. As though I were a drain, a leaky faucet, a problem to be managed. My son mumbled something I couldn't catch, but I caught enough. The sigh, the reluctance, the agreement. That was the night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and realized that the betrayal was not an event, but a campaign. Quiet and deliberate. Meant to erode me little by little until I either submitted to invisibility or left of my own accord. And perhaps they thought that would absolve them, that if I left willingly, they could tell the neighbors, the friends, the church ladies, that it had been my choice. But I knew the truth. They were pushing me out, not with shouts or eviction, but with small humiliations designed to make me believe I no longer belonged. What makes betrayal cut deepest is not that someone chooses another over you, but that they rewrite your history in the process. My son, who once pressed his face against my shoulder and whispered his secrets, now treated me like an obligation. My daughter-in-law, who had once called me Mom in the early days of marriage, now looked at me like a contaminant, and I began to see the shape of their plan. Whispers about assisted living, brochures left out on the counter, questions about whether I had updated my will. I heard her on the phone once, her voice sharp but hushed. It would be easier if we had more control over her assets. My assets, my life, my savings, my home, spoken of like pieces on a board, tools for their convenience. That was betrayal too. Not only the emotional exile, but the greed stitched into it, the hunger for what was mine, dressed up as concern. And again, my son did not stop it. He did not say, "Enough, she has given enough." He let it continue, because his peace was more valuable than my dignity. So if you ask me what the true betrayal was, I will not say it was the word filthy, though that was the spark. It was the silence that followed. The silence of my own child who found it easier to let me be humiliated than to stand beside me. It was the slow removal of my presence from their lives, the careful erasure of my contributions, the transformation of my existence from mother and grandmother into nuisance, burden, ghost. Betrayal is not always sudden. Sometimes it is a steady drip that hollows you out. And I, who had spent my life filling the gaps for others, found myself hollowed by the very people I had held up. That is what broke me, not the insult, not even the greed, but the certainty that I was alone in my own home, and that the people who should have stood with me had already chosen to look away. It did not happen overnight. The deepening of the silence, the quiet worsening of my position in that house. It came slowly, so slowly that if you were a stranger walking through the rooms, you might not notice at all. You might see only the polished counters and the smiling family, the fresh flowers in vases, the framed photographs of children posed on beaches and playgrounds. But if you lived inside it as I did, if you breathed its air and listened closely enough, you would hear the sound of erasure, deliberate and unhurried, like someone carefully scrubbing away. The outline of a figure in a painting until there was only a blank wall where once there had been a person. It began with little things, details so trivial on the surface that even I doubted myself, wondered if I was imagining the shift, but each detail carried weight, and together they formed a cage. My cup, as I said, bore the word guest, a label that was not peeled off after one day but replaced when it began to curl at the edges, renewed with fresh tape, as though to remind me that I was never to think of myself as belonging. At dinner, my seat moved, not at the head where I had once presided over meals, not even beside the children where I could help them cut their food, but at the far end, near the door, where I could be overlooked or excused first if needed. And when neighbors visited, I was introduced in tones that shifted from mother to Mary, and eventually to, "Oh, this is just family," vague enough that no one would ask questions, vague enough to keep me blurred. The laundry was the battlefield where the humiliation took its most tangible form. Once I lived for the rhythm of washing, the sorting and folding, the way order could be coaxed out of chaos. But now every attempt I made to continue this labor was met with suspicion or outright refusal. I would find my hands swatted away, not always physically, but with words sharp enough to sting. "Leave it, I'll do it." Or, "We don't want things mixed." Or, the dreaded, "Don't touch that." Clothes I had begun folding would be refolded in front of me. Slowly, deliberately, as if to show me how it was properly done, as if decades of keeping a household had left me unqualified. The message was not about hygiene at all. I knew it deep in my bones. It was about power, about making me feel useless, redundant, dispensable. A woman who cannot wash or fold has no foothold in the daily life of a family, and without that foothold, she drifts into irrelevance. That was the goal, though no one admitted it, to make me irrelevant enough to erase without guilt. The worst of it was the stillness of my son. He rarely joined in the corrections or the little cruelties, but his silence was permission, and in many ways it cut deeper than any insult. I would look at him, hoping for a flicker of recognition, some acknowledgement that I was being diminished, but his eyes would slide away, fixed on his phone, on the children, on anything but me. He had learned to live with the discomfort of my humiliation, to normalize it until it was no longer visible to him. That, I realized, was how betrayal grows into habit, not with loud declarations, but with quiet adjustments, the willingness to let indignities pass unchecked because they are easier to ignore than to confront. Every day that passed with his silence, my place shrank further until I felt like an intruder in the very home I had once built. Objects began to vanish. My old teapot disappeared from the kitchen shelves, replaced by a sleek metal thing that looked like it belonged in a catalog. When I asked, she said lightly, "It was chipped. I tossed it." Though I knew it had not been. A framed photo of me and my husband, taken on our 25th anniversary, vanished from the mantel. When I inquired, my son said perhaps it was in storage, though I had not stored it. The Afghan I had crocheted decades ago for the living room, bright with colors chosen by my son when he was a child, was folded away into a closet. Slowly, quietly, without confrontation, the evidence of my life was being packed up, erased, overwritten by objects that bore no trace of me. It was not vandalism, it was curation, and it was deadlier than open hostility. Because in curation, you do not fight. You simply replace until nothing of the original remains. Even the children absorbed the unspoken lesson. My grandson, who once crawled onto my lap without hesitation, now hesitated. glancing toward his mother before leaning into me. My granddaughter, once eager to help me stir cake batter, began to parrot her mother's words, saying things like, "Mommy says don't touch that, Grandma." The words were not cruel from her lips. She was a child repeating what she heard, but they pierced me all the same, because I could see the inheritance of distance being passed down. They would grow up not remembering me as the woman who raised their father, but as the quiet figure in the corner, the one who was always on the edge of photographs, the one who carried the label of inconvenience. That, perhaps, was the cruelest part, the corruption of memory before it even had the chance to form. The escalation was not dramatic, not at first. It was in the rhythm of being dismissed, of hearing footsteps fade down the hall while I remained behind, of conversations lowering in volume when I entered, of laughter that resumed only after I left. It was in the way she would spray counters after I touched them, a quick mist of chemical cleanliness that was less about germs and more about signaling contamination. It was in the way my son avoided inviting me on errands, saying, "It'll be quicker if it's just us," though I had once been the one to take him everywhere, patient with his delays, with his chatter. Slowly, insidiously, I felt myself being edited out, not with shouting or orders, but with the steady rhythm of neglect. It was death by 1,000 omissions. At night, I lay in bed and thought about stains, how some sink into fabric so deep they never truly wash out, how you can scrub and still find the shadow of them when the cloth catches the light. I wondered if I was the stain in their lives, if that was how they saw me. And then I realized the truth. They were trying to make me believe it, to convince me of my own worthlessness, so that when they finally pushed me out, I would go willingly. Thinking it was for the best, that realization terrified me more than any insult, because it meant the cruelty was not accidental, not thoughtless, but intentional. And once you know that, once you see the shape of their intention, you cannot unsee it. One afternoon, I stood at the window and watched the neighbor hang laundry on a line, bright sheets snapping in the wind, and I felt tears sting my eyes, not because of the beauty of it, but because I remembered myself years ago, doing the same, my arms strong, my heart full, believing I was building a life that would last. Now I saw that life narrowing to a single dark room, my presence reduced to something inconvenient. That was the first escalation, the deepening of silence into absence, the slow turning of my existence into something they could fold away like a worn blanket. And I knew even then that if I did not act, if I did not find some foothold, I would vanish altogether, erased not by death, but by design. The shift began not with a grand decision or a thunderous confrontation, but with something so small I almost missed it, something that would seem meaningless to anyone else. But to me, it was the first crack in the shell of silence I had been forced into. It happened one gray morning when I bent to gather a pile of laundry from the basket, shirts and socks mixed together in a tangled heap, and she swooped in as though I had been about to commit a crime, her voice sharp and loud in the stillness of the house. "I told you, don't touch that. It's mine." Her face twisted with that same disgust, her hands pulling the fabric away from me as if my touch had soiled it. And for the first time, I did not bow my head. I did not apologize. I did not retreat into the corner of my room with the sting of shame. Instead, I looked at her directly and said quietly, almost calmly, "Filthy? You should look in the mirror, greed has left stains you'll never wash out." The words came from somewhere deep, from a part of me that had been waiting decades to speak. And though my voice did not rise, though I did not shout, the silence that followed was thunderous. She blinked, stunned, perhaps more by the fact that I had spoken at all than by what I had said, and for a long moment neither of us moved. Then she turned away, muttering something under her breath. But I remained standing there, my chest trembling with a strange mixture of fear and relief. I had spoken, and though the house did not collapse, though my son did not rush in to defend me, something inside me shifted permanently. That night, I lay in bed, not replaying her insult as I usually did, but replaying my own words, turning them over in my mind like smooth stones. It had been so long since I had defended myself that I had forgotten what it felt like to use language as armor, to assert that I was not simply an object to be pushed aside. And though the victory was small, it was mine, and I held it close. I realized then that the power they held over me was not in their words or their exclusions, but in my silence, in my willingness to accept their definitions of me. If I could break that silence even once, I could break it again, and perhaps again, until I had carved out a space of my own. That thought carried me through the days that followed, and with it came a quiet rebellion, not loud enough to provoke open war, but steady enough to remind me of who I had been before they decided I was nothing. I began with the laundry, the very task they had tried to strip from me. Instead of touching their clothes, I gathered my own, small as the pile was, and carried it down the street to the laundromat. It was humiliating at first, the thought that I, who had once run a household of 4, now stood in a public space with my modest bundle. But then something unexpected happened. A woman beside me, folding towels with careful precision, glanced at me and said, "You fold beautifully. You must have done this your whole life." There was no irony in her voice, no cruelty, just recognition. And I felt tears burn my eyes at the simplicity of it. That single sentence reminded me that my skill was not dirt, not contamination, but evidence of years of care and work, of love rendered into fabric. I walked back home lighter than I had felt in months, holding my neat stack of clothes as though they were proof of my existence. From that day, I made the laundromat my refuge. I began to set aside coins, to plan my trips, to take my time smoothing and folding. Strangers smiled at me, nodded, sometimes struck up conversations, and though these exchanges were brief, they were enough to remind me that I was still visible, still capable of connection beyond the walls of that house. At home, I stopped offering to fold their things, stopped waiting to be useful. Instead, I kept to my own small rituals, and in those rituals, I rediscovered fragments of myself I thought had been lost. I brewed tea in a cup I bought with my own money, kept hidden from their cupboards, and drank it slowly, savoring the taste of ownership. I bought a bar of soap with a scent I liked, lavender and rosemary, and placed it in my drawer so that when I opened it, the smell reminded me that I had not disappeared. These were small acts, invisible to them, but each was a seed of defiance, each a reminder that my life was still mine to shape. The turning point came one afternoon when my son, pressed by his wife's complaints, told me in that careful voice, "Mom, maybe it's best if you just stay in your room when she's doing chores. It avoids tension." In the past, I would have nodded, would have obeyed, would have retreated into silence. But this time, I met his eyes and said softly, "It's my house, too." The words startled him. I saw it in the way his mouth opened and then closed again, the way his gaze flickered to the floor. He did not argue, but he did not acknowledge it either, and yet for me that moment was enough. I had reminded him of a truth they both preferred to forget. I was not a guest. I was not an intruder. I was not someone living on borrowed grace. I had roots in that soil deeper than either of them, and no amount of dismissal could change that. From then on, I carried myself differently, not loudly, not confrontationally, but with a steadiness that could not be erased. When she snatched laundry from my hands, I did not flinch. When she sighed at my presence, I did not shrink. When my son looked away, I looked back until he shifted uncomfortably. I began to write small notes to myself, reminders tucked into the pages of old books. You are not filthy. You are the keeper of memory. They cannot erase you without your permission. These notes were not for anyone else to see, but for me, a quiet testament that my voice still existed even if no one else wanted to hear it. And with each note, with each load of laundry at the laundromat, with each cup of tea brewed for myself alone, I felt the shift grow stronger. It was not yet freedom, not yet escape, but it was the beginning of agency, the rediscovery of a spine that had bent too long under the weight of obedience. I was still trapped in their house, still subject to their cruelties, still aware of the plans they whispered about my future. But inside me, something was changing. I was no longer waiting for kindness from them. I was giving it to myself. And though they did not see it, could not measure it, the shift was real. I was no longer simply surviving their contempt. I was beginning, quietly, to resist it. And that resistance, though small and invisible, was the first taste of power I had known in years. The quiet shift that had begun within me was fragile, delicate as a thread pulled loose from old cloth, and though it gave me courage in small moments, it was quickly tested by the weight of their persistence. For cruelty rarely accepts silence as defeat. It presses harder, it sharpens its edges, it doubles back with new strategies, determined to remind the one who resists that resistance will cost more than obedience. In the weeks after I began refusing to shrink, after I began taking my laundry to the laundromat and speaking simple truths aloud, I noticed their eyes on me in a new way, sharper, measuring, as though they sensed the tremor of independence beneath my stillness and feared what it might mean. My daughter-in-law began to watch me as though I were plotting something in secret, her gaze following me not with open confrontation, but with that brittle suspicion of someone who believes control is slipping. She would pause at doors as I passed, her smile stretched too wide, her voice too sweet when neighbors were near. But when the door closed, her tone hardened into stone. My son spoke less than before, but the little he did say revealed more than he intended, half phrases that slipped out like crumbs from a pocket. It's not sustainable. We'll have to think long-term. She's not cooperating. These words fell heavy into my ears, and though no plan was spoken directly, I understood enough, because I had lived long enough to know the sound of being managed, of being treated not as family, but as a problem to be solved. One evening I walked into the kitchen and found a glossy brochure left open on the counter. Its photograph, a smiling older woman playing cards with strangers in a common room that gleamed too clean to be lived in. The text read, "A safe, vibrant community for your loved one. My loved one." I turned the page and saw another photograph. A man my age sitting in a recliner with a forced grin, a nurse's hand resting on his shoulder, as though he were a child. At the bottom, in bright letters, "Assisted living made simple." My stomach turned. The betrayal was not in the brochure itself, but in the way it had been left there, not hidden in a drawer, not placed discreetly, but displayed openly, as if to test my reaction, as if to remind me of where they thought I belonged. When I closed it, my daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway, her voice syrupy. "Just looking at options," she said. "You know, in case things get harder." Harder for whom? I wanted to ask, but I bit my tongue. My son stepped in a moment later, his hand resting on her back, his eyes not meeting mine. "We just want what's best," he murmured. And I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, because best had nothing to do with it. Best was for them, not for me. The pressure did not come only from brochures or whispers. It came in smaller cruelties, escalated and sharpened now that I had begun to resist invisibility. One afternoon I found my laundry basket empty, though I had left it half full of my own clothes. When I asked, she shrugged and said she had taken care of it. Hours later, I discovered my blouses crumpled in a bag under the sink, damp and sour, as though they had been washed with mop cloths and forgotten. The message was clear. If I insisted on keeping my independence, they would contaminate even that. Another day, I opened the refrigerator to find my small carton of milk gone, replaced with almond milk I had never bought. Her voice sharp when I questioned it. "We're making healthier choices now. You should too." I had no say, no corner of the house that was truly mine, no belonging that could not be tampered with. Even my room began to feel like a borrowed cell, the air thick with the knowledge that I was being tolerated, not welcomed. The past began to return in ways I had not expected. Memories came unbidden at night when I lay awake, listening to the muted arguments through the walls, the whispered discussions that always seemed to circle back to me. I remembered my husband, gone now so many years, and his voice telling me once that the danger of giving too much is that people come to believe it was never a gift, but an obligation. I remembered the early years of raising my son, when I had nothing but the strength of my own hands to keep us afloat, when I worked long shifts and came home to scrub laundry by hand because we could not afford machines, when he would sit beside me, babbling about his day while I folded his tiny shirts. How had that boy become this man who could not speak one word in my defense? How had the bond of mother and child become so brittle that he could stand by while his wife called me filthy, while his wife erased me piece by piece? These questions gnawed at me, kept me from sleep, and in the silence of those long nights, I began to understand that the escalation was not only external, but internal, the past pressing against the present, demanding to be reckoned with. Then came the letter, the first in decades that made my hands tremble as I unfolded it. It was from my grandson, written in that uneven scrawl of a teenager who has not yet learned to tame his handwriting. "Grandma," it began, "where are you? Mom and Dad are worried, but I don't believe them when they say you're fine. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay." There was no return address, only a phone number scribbled at the bottom. But that letter struck me harder than any insult, because in his words I heard sincerity, not performance, not manipulation, just longing. And in that longing, I saw the possibility of a future untainted by his parents' cruelty, a thread of connection that might still be salvaged. The letter was hidden quickly when she entered the room, stuffed into my dresser drawer like contraband, but its presence burned in my mind. If he still saw me, if he still wanted me, then I was not yet erased, not entirely. But with that glimmer came fear, for I knew they would not tolerate even that connection if they discovered it. The escalation reached its sharpest point the night I overheard them arguing about my finances. I was passing the hallway when I caught her voice, low and urgent. She still has her own account. We need access. It's irresponsible for her to manage it at her age. My son murmured something, hesitant. But then I heard her sharper reply. What if she spends it all? What if she gives it away? We need to secure it for the children. The children, always the children, always the excuse for control. But I knew the truth. They wanted security for themselves, a safety net built from the labor of my life, from the pennies I had saved while denying myself small pleasures, from the sacrifices I had made while they built their curated existence. My name, my autonomy, my dignity. They wanted it signed away under the guise of love. In that moment, I realized the danger was no longer only humiliation, no longer only invisibility, but the theft of my future, the erasure of the last remnants of my independence. I lay awake that night and listened to the pipes groan and the wind rattle the windows, and I felt the weight of decision pressing on me. The quiet rebellion that had begun with words and laundry trips was no longer enough. They were circling, tightening, preparing to strip me of the last things I could still call my own. The escalation was no longer tolerable silence. It was a test of survival. And as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I whispered to myself a vow I had not made in years. I will not let them finish what they started. They may call me filthy, they may erase my photographs, they may plan my exile in glossy brochures, but they will not take from me the right to decide. That, I swore, would remain mine, even if I had to tear myself out of the house stone by stone to claim it. The breaking point came on a morning that looked like any other. Gray light seeping through curtains, the air heavy with the smell of detergent and coffee, the ordinary sounds of a household that had long since ceased to feel like mine. But beneath that ordinariness there pulsed a quiet certainty that something had to end. I had risen early, long before they stirred, and sat on the edge of my narrow bed, with the letter from my grandson folded in my lap, its paper already softened by my hands. And as I read his uneven words again, I realized that I could not remain here, waiting to be erased. They were no longer content with my silence. They wanted my compliance, my signature, my surrender of every last scrap of self. And if I stayed, I would eventually give it, not because I believed them, but because exhaustion wears down even the strongest stone. I could not allow myself to be worn into dust. So I opened the old trunk at the foot of my bed, the one that held the remnants of my life, and began to fill 2 suitcases with what mattered most. Clothes enough to keep me warm, photographs they had not yet stolen, my husband's watch, the few documents that still bore my name, and, most important, the folder of bank papers that proved what little security I still had. Each item folded into the suitcase felt like a reclamation, a reminder that I had not yet been stripped bare. I moved quietly, my ears straining for any sound from down the hall. And when I was finished, I sat for a long moment, staring at the pile of laundry I had begun the day before. Their clothes, not mine, half folded, half tumbled, waiting for me to finish the task they had forbidden me from claiming as my own. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, because how strange that my last act in this house would involve laundry, the very battlefield where so much humiliation had been staged. And yet, it seemed right, symbolic, necessary. So I finished folding their clothes, one by one, smoothing each shirt, pairing each sock, stacking them neatly into a pile that stood straight and silent on the kitchen table. On top, I pinned a note, written in my careful hand. You can wash your own stains. I am not your maid. I am not your shadow. I am done. The words did not tremble as I wrote them, though my hands shook. And when I stepped back to look at the pile, it seemed not like laundry at all, but like a monument, a small, quiet tombstone, marking the death of my silence. I carried my suitcases to the door just as the first sounds of waking stirred the house, the creak of floorboards, the soft murmur of water in pipes, the clink of cups in the kitchen. For a moment I hesitated, my heart pounding with the weight of all that I was leaving behind, not possessions or comfort, but the decades of sacrifice, the memories of raising my son within these walls, the ghosts of laughter and arguments and celebrations long past. But then I heard her voice sharp in the hallway, calling out something about the children's schedules, and I felt the familiar sting of erasure wrap around me like a chain. That was enough. I opened the door and stepped out into the morning air, the chill biting my cheeks, the sky pale and wide, and with each step down the walkway, I felt the chain loosen. At the corner, I flagged a cab, the driver loading my suitcases into the trunk without a word, and as I slid into the back seat, I did not look back at the house. I could not. If I had turned, I might have faltered, might have been caught again by the weight of memory. So I stared straight ahead as the car pulled away, watching the street slip behind me like water closing over a stone. The first place I went was the bank. The folder clutched tight against my chest. And when I walked through those glass doors, I felt my spine straighten with a determination I had not felt in years. I sat across from the clerk, a young man whose polite smile did not disguise his impatience, but I did not let it rattle me. I want to transfer my funds, I said clearly, into an account in my name only, with no secondary access, no shared signature. He blinked, asked questions, slid forms across the desk, but I signed them all with steady strokes. When he asked if I wanted to name beneficiaries, I shook my head. Not now, I said. Not them. The words came out sharper than I intended, but they felt clean, like cutting away rot. When the last paper was stamped and the folder handed back to me, I felt a wave of relief, as though I had reclaimed not just money, but a part of myself they had been circling like vultures. That account, modest though it was, represented choice, represented freedom, represented a future that was mine to shape, and no one else's. From the bank, I went to a small rental agency I had passed many times on my walks, its windows filled with faded photographs of apartments, most too cramped or too expensive. But one caught my eye, a simple flat with 2 rooms and a balcony, overlooking a narrow street. The agent barely looked at me at first, his attention fixed on his computer. But when I laid the deposit in cash on the table, his eyes sharpened, and suddenly he was all politeness, all courtesy, eager to hand me the keys. I walked out of that office with the metal cool against my palm, and in that moment, I knew I had crossed the threshold from thought to action. I was no longer waiting for their permission, no longer hoping for their kindness. I was writing my own script, one suitcase, one key, one decision at a time. By evening, I stood in the empty flat, my suitcases at my feet, the air smelling faintly of dust and old paint, and though the walls were bare and the furniture absent, it felt more like home than the house I had left behind. I opened the window and let the cool air rush in, carrying with it the sounds of the street below, children shouting, a dog barking, the hum of life uncurated, unpolished, raw, and real. I set my suitcases down and unfolded a single towel, thick and white, one I had bought with my own money weeks earlier as a secret act of defiance, and laid it across the narrow bed frame that stood against the wall. That towel, untouched by anyone else, felt like a flag planted in new soil, a declaration that this space was mine. I sat on the bed, exhausted but steady, and for the first time in years, I felt not like a burden, but like a person. The climax of my story was not in the drama of slamming doors or shouted confrontations, but in the quiet finality of leaving, in the irrevocable step of reclaiming what they thought they had already taken. There was no going back. Even if they came to me with apologies or pleas, even if my son wept at my absence, I knew I could never return to that house as a silent shadow. The act of leaving, of securing my name, of holding a key to a space that was mine alone, had broken the spell. It was irreversible, and in that irreversibility lay my strength. I had folded their laundry one last time, but it was no longer an act of service. It was a message carved into fabric, a closing chapter. The stains they had tried to smear on me remained theirs, and I walked away cleaner than I had ever been. The days that followed were quiet, in a way I had almost forgotten life could be. Not the suffocating quiet of being ignored in a house where laughter only resumed once I had left the room, but the gentle quiet of solitude chosen, the kind of stillness that allows you to hear your own breath, your own thoughts, the steady rhythm of being alive without needing permission from anyone. In the mornings I rose when I pleased, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, and I boiled water in a kettle I had bought for myself, its whistle bright and sharp, announcing not servitude, but independence. I drank from a cup I chose, not one labeled for me, and the taste of tea was different, fuller somehow, as though the absence of shame had changed the flavor. Each small ritual, folding my own towel, hanging a blouse on the back of a chair, placing my shoes neatly by the door, felt like an act of reclamation, a declaration that I was still here, still capable, still clean. The apartment was modest, bare at first, its walls echoing, its floors creaking with each step. But I filled it slowly with objects that belonged only to me. A second-hand lamp from the flea market, warm with yellow light. A quilt I stitched together from scraps of fabric I had hoarded for years, each piece carrying a memory, each stitch an act of defiance against erasure. A plant by the window, green and stubborn, stretching toward the sun. These things did not impress visitors, though I had none. But they impressed me because they were chosen, not given, not tolerated, not begrudged. And with every object, with every deliberate choice, I felt the filth they had tried to smear on me wash away. At night, I thought sometimes of the house I had left, the rooms where my voice had been muted, the table where I had been pushed to the margins, the laundry room where the word filthy had been hurled like a stone. I imagined them unfolding the note I had left pinned to their pile of clothes, their faces tightening with anger or perhaps confusion, and I felt no guilt. They would tell their own story about me, of course, how I had been difficult, how I had refused help, how I had chosen to leave because of stubborn pride. But I knew the truth, and the truth was enough. I had left not because I was weak, not because I was mad, but because I was strong enough to refuse to be diminished any longer. That strength, long buried under years of silence, had finally broken free, and there was no taking it back. Sometimes, in the laundromat near my new home, I see women like me, shoulders bent, eyes tired, folding clothes with practiced precision while the world passes them by, and I feel a strange mixture of sorrow and solidarity. Once I might have envied their freedom if they lived apart from families that erased them. Now I want to reach across the folding table and whisper what I have learned. You are not filthy. You are not invisible. You are not disposable. The stains are not yours to carry. They belong to those who treat love as servitude and gratitude as debt. If they call you dirty, it is because they cannot bear the shine of your endurance. If they push you aside, it is because they fear the weight of your memory, which outlasts their shallow comfort. I do not speak these words aloud, but I hold them in my chest like a message meant to travel, like a letter folded into time itself, waiting for another woman to unfold it when she needs it most. I am 78, and for the first time in decades, I live not as someone's shadow, not as someone's burden, but as myself. The towels I fold are my own. The dishes I wash are mine alone. The bed I smooth at night bears only the imprint of my body. There is a dignity in this simplicity that I had forgotten, a dignity they could not erase no matter how many times they tried to brand me unworthy. I do not know how many years remain to me, but I know they will be mine, and that knowledge fills me with a peace greater than any apology could. When I open my window in the mornings and breathe in the air of the street below, I feel cleaner than I ever did under their roof, for the filth they accused me of was never on my skin, never in my hands. It was in their greed, their blindness, their cruelty. I carry no stain, and so, if you are listening, if you too have been called names meant to shrink you, if you too have been pushed into corners until you doubted your worth, hear me when I say this. Do not believe them. The stain is not on you. You are clean. You are the keeper of memory, the vessel of love, the one who has carried more than they will ever know. Walk out if you must, fold the last shirt and leave it behind, pin your truth to the fabric of their lives, and then step into the air that is yours. Do not look back. There is nothing behind you worth more than what waits ahead. Yourself, unbroken, untarnished, finally free.